Can't you hear? Can't you hear the thunder? You better run. You better take cover.
I finally decided to post this life-changing and defining experience that I had when I was about 9 or 10 years old. When I say life-changing and defining, I truly do mean that. Ever since I had this experience, I have had an obsession with the other world. And I know in my heart that there is a lot more to this earth than what we can see with our eyes. I had a lot of really strange experiences at this property, but what I am writing about was the beginning of a weird few years. So backtrack around 13 years ago, and I'm 9 or 10 years old. My parents and I had just moved up to a mountain in the Gold Coast hinterland, Tamborine Mountain, in Australia. Absolutely beautiful place, full of national parks and tropical rainforests. To explain the layout of our property, there was a main house, and about 100 meters to the left of the main house was a large shed. Separating the main house from the shed was a garden area, with a little path leading from the shed to the house. It was just after dark, maybe 7 p.m. My mum was inside the main house making dinner, and for some reason, I was outside with my dad at the shed whilst he was unloading things from the back of a truck with one of his mates. I helped for a little bit, but when it came to the bigger objects, I was just sitting around and admiring our beautiful new property. I can still remember this like it happened yesterday. So I'm sitting down and waiting for my dad to finish up so we can go back to the main house. And for some reason, and to this day I still do not know why, I had this intense urge to look over to my right into the bushes, which separated the main house from the shed. At first, I couldn't really tell what it was, but the longer I stared at it, the more I realized it was not a trick of the light or my imagination. About 30 feet away from me was a small thing walking parallel to where I was sitting, wading through the bushes. It was walking at a normal pace, but pushing the bushes back to make way for itself. I could only see the side profile of this thing, but I could see that over its body it was wearing something black, almost like a black cloak. From the side profile of its face, I could make out a pointed nose with sharp cheekbones and a large hole where I'm assuming its eye was. It was probably about 3 or 4 feet high and had the stature of a small child. I saw it for probably about 5 seconds. I think that it was probably the first time in my life I had an adrenaline rush. My heart dropped to my stomach and I felt sick and confused. I couldn't speak or move. All I could feel was utter fear and terror and this thing. I stood up and quickly bolted inside the shed and waited for my dad to finish up, because no way in hell was I going to walk back to the house by myself. It never looked at me. For all I know, it could have been before, but when I saw it did not look at me or acknowledge me. I didn't sleep in my own bed until I was 13 after that experience. I was utterly shit scared of the dark, and still to this day, I don't like going outside after dark by myself. The older I got, the more I began to research paranormal topics. I tried for so long to convince myself that this was just a hallucination, but I know in my heart it wasn't. The best description that I could give it would be, it looked like an alien grey, but the thing still had proportionate features, if that makes sense. I know this sounds insane, but it had the features of a goblin. Pointed ears and a sharp cheekbone. It was definitely wearing something black over the top of its shoulders, as I did not see its legs. The most messed up aspect of this experience for me is that to this day, I still have weird nightmares about that property. I've never forgotten that night, or how it has molded and changed my perception of this world. There is so much more out there that we don't know about. Has anyone else ever had an experience similar to this?
My dad told me this story from when he worked in a nursing home in Australia. It spooked me a bit, and I have no idea how he lasted as long as he did in that nursing home. For the record, my family are all skeptics as far as I know, but I think this is the one story that would persuade me that ghosts are real. My dad worked the night shift in a nursing home in Australia. He said he'd been told stories of deceased residents passing the front desk on the bottom floor, and even heard babies crying on the top floor. The nursing home used to be a maternity hospital, when there was no maternity clinic near it. There was a TV room on the bottom floor where some of the residents, who were definitely kept in bed all night for their own safety as they were some of the worst patients. He moved the chairs near the TV all the way back to the wall and locked the door. He came back an hour or so later, whilst waiting for the porter, and the door was open and one of the chairs was moved back across to the TV. The door hadn't been forced. There were no windows in the room. And even if there were, the chair was too heavy to be blown back across the room. The porter arrived, and my dad asked him about the occurrence. He said, "That's Bob's chair. He doesn't like it to be away from the TV." There was no Bob at the home. There used to be. He died. This is my dad's one and only experience with ghosts, and it chills me to the bone.
As a kid, I used to live in an old home in the suburbs of Perth, Western Australia. The home was built in 1939 and I believe it was war housing for vets after the Second World War. It was laid out in 2 sections. My parents bought the house in 2000. The original home was at the front of the house, which was quite small, creaky wooden floorboards and high ceilings. There was only about 3 rooms. My room, my sister's room, and a playroom. This part of the house was where a lot of the activity was centered. A hallway connected the old house to what was originally the backyard, but had been renovated to add a large, modern wing onto the existing structure. My parents' room was in this wing. I lived there until I was about 12 years old, and my experience begins at around 5 or 6. I'd started to hate sleeping in my room, and being in that part of the house in general. Every time I was there, I felt uneasy, even during broad daylight, and I had no idea why. I was overwhelmed with panic every time I crossed the threshold into the old wing by myself. Activity was usually focused in the toy room, the biggest room in that part of the house. Small things like toys moving and going missing, turning on in the middle of the night when they were switched off hours prior. Stuff like that. The first experience was when I was around 5. I had a vivid night terror of a dirt-covered black glove reaching out from under my pillow and attempting to grab me. When I told my parents, they seemed unbothered, although now I know this wasn't the case. This comes into play later. When I was around 7, I remember a Barbie keyboard my sister had turning on and playing some sort of tune late at night. My sister woke me up as any kid would, and we both went and woke up our parents. When they heard what was happening, they were visibly on edge, as this was not at all the first experience they had with that room. After some apprehension, my dad went in and turned the keyboard off. The ceiling light wouldn't turn on. It worked in the morning though. A separate occasion involving toys happened in my room. I was around 8 years old and I had a 2008 Mummy's Gold Matchbox toy set. If anyone is unfamiliar with it, it's a battery-powered track which, once a Matchbox car runs over a button or the button is pushed, activates a mummy's eyes to glow and a voice line,
"I've got you now,"
to play in that typical 2000s scratchy audio. I was having trouble sleeping late one night. I was wide awake, so it wasn't some half-asleep hallucination. The
"I've got you now"
broke the silence as I jolted to look at the track. Its arms were moving up and down repeatedly. A functionality the toy did not have. Its arms were only meant to move up and down once. After a few seconds it stopped. I had been playing with it earlier and remember switching it off. I didn't sleep well that night. I started sleeping on the couch in the living room after this, and I can recall multiple occasions in which a clock would fall off the wall. No matter where it was placed or what we used to hang it up, it fell off every time. The activity was fairly quiet for the remaining couple of years we lived there. Basic spirit stuff like bangs, scratching noises, a cold breeze when there are no windows or doors open, dogs barking at doorways and corners when there's nothing there. We moved out in 2013. It's only years later that my parents told me about their experiences. They are now divorced and rarely agree on things, but this is one of them. The toy room used to be my sister's room when she was a baby, and the usual toy room stuff applies. Baby monitors, recording sounds of a lullaby player which has no batteries in it, or was put away in a closet only to be mysteriously attached to the crib again before being found halfway across the room in the morning. But by far the most disturbing account is that of a dark figure. Both my parents experienced waking up in the dead of night only to see a tall, dark figure around 6 feet tall, wearing a trench coat and standing over the other person as they sleep. The figure was always gone after a blink, and they each only saw it once, years apart. But it makes them uneasy just talking about it. Though it's not directly a first-hand experience, it helps corroborate my experiences. The part that terrifies me is their recount of its gloves. Both of them recalled it wearing black, dirty gloves, just like the ones I'd seen in my night terror as a child. That's pretty much it. Anybody have any idea what kind of spirit this could be? I don't doubt somebody died in the house, given its age, but I don't know how to categorize it. Thanks for listening. So I thought I'd just share some things we've experienced in our rental that were a little too eerie to pass off as coincidence. I'm not a great storyteller, so I'll write them in a list form. These have all happened over the last 18 months. The place is an apartment on the 2nd floor in Sydney, Australia. 1. Every night I clean the kitchen after dinner. Nothing's left out or in the sink. Benchtops are empty. I have a work tool, a 150mm steel ruler I lost maybe 3 months prior. I woke up one morning to make coffee before work, flicked the light on and my ruler was in the sink. I hadn't seen it in months, and it definitely was not in there the night prior. 2. My wife and I had just finished taking a shower, and we were drying off in the bathroom. We heard the click of the electric kettle. I asked if she'd flicked it on before we jumped in, and she said no, and asked if I had. I walked out to inspect, and the click we heard was the kettle turning on, not off. 3. My wife had hung photos on the walls around the house. I was working interstate one night when she called me terrified, because the 3 in our bedroom had come off the wall and crashed down at the same time. The hooks were still on the wall. 4. This one really creeped me out. I woke up at 5 a.m. for work one morning and saw a light flickering from our lounge room. I walked out and saw a custom candle we had made for our wedding gifts was lit and flickering away. And it was 100% not lit the night before, as it was in a photo I had uploaded to my Instagram. My wife also swears she sees something, out of the corner of her eye at least weekly. I'd love to hear people's thoughts on this. I'm not too worried if it is something paranormal. It hasn't seemed destructive, except for maybe trying to burn the place down. Thanks for listening. Edit. I just remembered something else that happens maybe monthly. We'll often find plugs pulled from sockets that neither of us have touched.
I'm an Australian Scout, and about 2 years ago, I was a Cub when this happened, so the order goes Joeys, Cubs, Scouts, and Ventures, if that helps. Now, I went to this big Cub camp, roughly 1,000+ Scouts, called Spookaria. It's when Cubs from all around Australia come together and do activities and do Scout things, I don't know. Anyways, my group was called Cassowaries, with a bunch of girls and 7-ish girls. Me, my sister, and other girls shared a tent. We stayed there for a week. But on the 5th night, I woke up at roughly 3 to 5 a.m. by my sister. She looked terrified. She told me to look at the end of my sleeping bag, and when I looked there was blood. I crawled out of my sleeping bag with a hole at the end of the sleeping bag. I looked at my foot, and there was a stab wound just under my toes. Me and my sister sat there staring at my foot until I noticed a light through the side of my tent. It looked as though a knife was cut through, and it stabbed me. Me and my sister walked out of the tent with a flashlight. Our tent was right next to the fence. As we walked around the tent, I saw a pure white figure staring at me from behind the fence. My sister told me not too long ago she saw the same thing. We woke the other girls and started to walk to the toilets. They were around 15 minutes from our tent. We told them what we saw. My sister didn't say she also saw the figure. One of the girls believed us, the others didn't. I showed them my foot and the hole in the tent, but they still didn't believe me. Ever since then, I've been having the same figure follow me. Not in the open or in big crowds. They show up in my dreams. I've seen them quite a lot. I don't know how to communicate with them, or if I want to. They act sort of as if they're a guardian, or they're trying to protect me, and it feels like they only show themselves when I'm doing something stupid or I'm having bad anxiety. If you have any advice about what I should do, that would be awesome. Thank you.
I don't necessarily believe my experiences have anything to do with extraterrestrials, and I maintain a lot of skepticism. However, the human brain does what it does, and that means recognizing patterns wherever it can. I find consistencies with my story that line up with many phenomena associated with alien encounters. Firstly, let me give you some background information. I'm a 17-year-old living in Darwin, Australia. I frequently have sporadic episodes of insomnia. I've deduced this to overall stress and anxiety. Despite this, I can recall trouble sleeping derived from either nightmares or just general restlessness since I was a kid, so keep that in mind. My first encounter was on a camping trip with my grandmother to a dam reserve 3 hours from our town. During the holidays and weekends, families spent their time fishing, hiking, and doing other recreational activities. But during the week, virtually no one was there, so sometimes my grandma would take my brother and me for little excursions. I was about 7 or 8 at the time, living in rural New South Wales. This time my brother didn't want to come, so it was just my grandma and me. The camping spot overlooked the water. Dead grey-silver trees lined the shore. I remember very little about the trip other than the experience. We were in our swags, or sleeping bags, looking at the sky. The lack of light pollution meant that the stars shone incredibly bright. My grandma was dozing off when I saw the first shooting star fly over the Southern Cross. I nudged to tell her, "That's cool. she said, closing her eyes again. I saw another but decided not to wake her. Then, another, and another. I woke her. She stayed up long enough to see a whole meteor shower. She joked, saying she nearly missed it because she didn't believe me. After 10 minutes, the shooting stars stopped and she closed her eyes for the last time that night. I stayed awake. I was just pumped that I had seen something so cool. Then, after failing to count stars, I saw a little orb of light appear on the left of the Southern Cross. Bright white, with a blue lining around the edge. About a quarter of the size of a full moon, just sitting there. I had heard about UFOs from my granddad and older brother talking about them, from living in Alice Springs, but wasn't completely sure what one was at this point. Hell, I didn't even know that UFO was an acronym, or that they had any affiliation with aliens. A minute or two of hovering stationary, it sort of started to slide left further, then sped up and finally darted off, leaving a thin light trail akin to the shooting stars. Then with a quiet crack, it disappeared. That was the first and only time I had seen a UFO. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but now, I find it fascinating. Whether it had any relation to extraterrestrials was beyond me, however. The second experience was a much closer encounter with something that happened between 3 and 5 years ago. I'm something of a night owl. Back in my early high school days, I'd stay up until 2 in the morning, reading or watching movies or deciding that was a good time to do homework. I came out of my room to put a mug in the sink after I finished my tea. I used my phone's flashlight to see because I didn't want to wake my brother. The light was faint, but enough to see my reflection in the glass and notice a pair of orange lights. I looked behind me, thinking it was from a kitchen appliance or something, but there was no light. I turned back around, kinda shitting myself. The lights were closer and I could see a faint, pale silhouette against the dark garden. I was kind of frozen in fear. All I could do was stare at these two hypnotic eyes of whatever it was staring at me. It was almost like how an animal's eyes look under a flashlight, but like it had its own source. I was worried that any sudden moves would spook it or prompt some sudden movement from the creature. I was preparing myself to turn my back and run to my room, but was terrified it might chase me or come inside. Living in rural Australia, we don't really bother locking doors. No one breaks in. I felt we were staring at one another for the longest time, but it couldn't have been for more than a minute. A minute and a half tops. I counted to 3 and bolted to my room, jumped in bed and pulled the covers over my face. I remember this ringing in my ears from the adrenaline and shaking from fear. Quite frankly, I am surprised I didn't pee myself. I had to sleep with a light on that night. I regret not assessing how tall it was. All I can remember is a pale humanoid figure and those glowing eyes. A few months after this, I got up to open the curtains and louvres of my room to let the cool, dry season air in. I felt that shock again, seeing the same pair of orange eyes staring back at me. This time, from behind a cluster of golden cane palms, in the garden 15 meters from my window. This time, however, I yelled in shock, startling the creature that sprang off into the night. Let me tell you how relieved I was that I didn't have to sprint to my room this time. I just had to leap into my bed. After this, I haven't seen anything like this again. This experience was pretty weird, and is why I mentioned having trouble sleeping. It could very likely just be my tendency to sleepwalk. On a couple of occasions, I've woken up on the lawn beside my house. Not sure why, but it's an awfully daunting feeling to wake up outside on the ground, somewhere you don't remember falling asleep, And even worse, with a small rock embedded in your arm. You know, like when it had been sitting there for so long that it kind of sticks to your arm. I woke up because the rooster started going off. The sun had just started to come up, and it was mostly dark still, so I went inside through the back door, which, by the way, was still open, and went to my room for a couple of hours of sleep. The second time this happened was on the same lawn. I woke startled because the sprinkler had started and I was sprayed. I felt this uncomfortable familiarity with the situation. I got up and went inside for my second shower of the day. Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. As always, a big thank you to all of the Reddit users who kindly allowed me to use their stories. If you want to help support this channel, you will find links to both my Patreon and my Teespring store in the description below, so feel free to have a look. And the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. I truly do appreciate it. And remember,
Papa loves you.